May I interrupt your lunches? I'm glad to hear you've had a chance to get to know some of the other speakers and participants. But at this point, I'd like to introduce our lunch keynote speaker. And it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce him because, as he pointed out when I called to invite him to speak, he and I hadn't spoken in 25 years when we graduated from high school together here in Washington at St. Albans, where Ian Urbina was the star nationally, not locally, cross-country runner, and that was the image I had for him until about 6 months ago when I was reading the New York Times and came across the first of a series of articles that many of you will have seen on the outlaw ocean. This series was particularly interesting to me because in my own academic research, I spend a significant amount of my time studying maritime piracy. And so when I saw that Ian was doing this work, initially the first piece focused on piracy, and then watching it expand, I was impressed because I understood the complexity and nature of the kind of research he had to do as an investigative reporter, which he'll be talking to you about firsthand. Today's lunch is intended to do two different things. The first, and it was mentioned in one of the opening remarks, is to bring a different perspective to today's discussions, to talk about how reporting on the types of things we're discussing here today is done, and some of the bigger lessons that can come out of that, and Ian will walk us through that a little bit. But also, as you saw during the Q&A in the last session, the issues of lawlessness on the high seas, whether it be piracy, human trafficking, illegal fishing, are all issues that are connected intimately with the subject of our full day's symposium, and in particular, the absence of rule of law. And so I think Ian will bridge nicely our morning into our afternoon and speak to us specifically about this project he's been engaged in, the Outlaw Ocean. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Ian.
So Joel stole my opening line, which was to recount the fact that we haven't seen each other since 1990. So I will just dive right into it. It's a real honor to be here, and an odd sense of arrival, not just to sort of in your hometown speak at such an illustrious place in front of such a crowd, but also with a colleague from high school. And I think we had heard that our high school teacher was going to attend, so that was going to really kind of put a bow on the whole thing, but I think he may have not shown. My plan was simple here. It was to just tell you folks what I do and what I did and what we are doing with this series. What I do is I'm an investigative reporter for the Times. I've been at the paper since '02. And essentially what that means is I have the luxury of time, as different from beat reporters. I am supposed to dig deep, and I'm given more time to do that, with the expectation that hopefully I'll find virgin snow topically, and also with the expectation that as an investigative reporter, you're supposed to focus on things that are broken and highlight them. So I've been doing that for about a decade now for the paper, and I would say that this is probably the project I've enjoyed the most of all that I've done. This series is called The Outlaw Ocean, and we launched on it about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. And it was born of a simple idea. And the idea was I had spent some time working in grad school on a cargo ship in Asia, and had always been enamored in this sort of very conceptual way with the sea. And that time working on the sea made me fairly fascinated by seafarers in particular, sort of a diaspora, a tribe of workers that kind of circumvent the globe and rarely are heard from or seen, and yet they play a huge role in providing us with 90% of what we consume. And I thought, boy, what an amazing thing if we could take the reader to that space, a space that most of us don't often or ever get to go, and also learn a little bit about the people that work there. So initially it started as I was more interested in the people, not the fish. And funny, when I pitched the idea at my editor, she said, I don't like fish, so I want the series, but no fish. And as I left the office, I said, wait, so I'm doing an investigative series on the ocean, but no fish? And she said, yeah. So from there, it became a series that really was focusing specifically on lawlessness on the high seas, because that seemed to be a framework of a number of stories that I wanted to go after all fit under that umbrella. So what I'll do then is I'm going to try in, I think about 20 minutes, blitz through the 6 stories. The series is ongoing. I'm looking at my phone not because I'm checking email, because I'm going to put a clock on myself. I think that we have maybe 2 more stories left to produce in this series. We've produced 6 large stories. And what I thought might be most useful is to just sort of go through each of them. And maybe some of you had read some of them already. So if you have, forgive me for the redundancy here. But I feel like that's the best path. So I'll start, and I don't know if, I guess everyone can see some semblance of the screen. And I'll apologize also, I'm not a great multitasker, so I may stutter a little bit. So this is the project page, the Outlaw Ocean project page, and as you'll see here, there are 6 main stories so far. And there are also a lot of subordinate stories, which are more applied. They're Q&As, they're the editorials from, that the paper wrote on what to do, and it's sort of bells and whistles. But the main bar stories are these 6. And the first story is what you call in a series a throat clear, and that's when you kind of get the attention of the people in the room, you clear your throat. And so this is meant to be sort of a high altitude, big picture, pay attention, here's what we're about to do over the next year here. This story was meant to, its initial idea was simple, and it was, what if we look for, if our point is that there's a lot of lawlessness on the high seas, what if we look for a single ship and make it our main character? And the ship would be chosen because it would be illustrative, it would be a poster child of bad behavior, essentially. Oddly, it took a long time to figure out which ship, because there are a lot of bad ships with a lot of well-documented misbehavior. So after sort of a beauty contest, if you will, we settled on one ship that I was enamored with for this purpose, called the Donna Liberta. You can see it here. It now, or at least about 4 months ago, was the Sea Pearl. And we chose the Donna Liberta because it had 3 categories of well-documented crimes that I thought were worth discussing, because they are either dramatic, not pervasive, but dramatic, and or pervasive. The first crime that the Donna Liberta was involved in was abuse of stowaways. Not a huge problem by the numbers, several hundred a year. Likely, this is a sort of dark realm, it's hard to quantify. But in the case of the Donna Liberta, the story was this. The Donna Liberta, Greek-owned, at that point, Indonesian crewed ship, was docked in Cape Town. 2 Tanzanians snuck on board, sort of standard stowaway demographic, young, male, poor, had made their way to South Africa and Cape Town because it's a famous spot for stowaways. They snuck on board and they hid out in the engine room. Ship left port, men discovered, men locked in a room, crew, captain figure out what to do. Some context here. Post 9/11, rules got tight for obvious reasons. And to show up at a port with people on board that were not documented had major consequences for cargo ships. This is a mother ship. This is a ship, the Donna Liberta is a ship that mostly handled tuna at that point. Didn't do the fishing, but transported the fish. And if you showed up with stowaways in a port, often the penalties could be in the hundreds of thousands, and those would be levied on the company, and the company would pass it down often to the captain. And so captains often turn to crews and say, deal with it. Deal with these guys. I don't care how you do it. I don't want to hear about it, but deal with these guys. Because if you don't, that's coming out of your wages. And so that downward sort of post 9/11 pressure had real consequences for stowaways, because how they were dealt with, you can figure out. So these 2 stowaways were found, locked down, and next thing they know, they're called up on deck, and they are told to look over the edge, and there's a raft, which is a tabletop about the size of the one you're sitting at, flat, without handles, a tabletop, and then it's tethered to steel drums. And there it floats, tied to the side of the Don Lamberto, way off at sea. A storm rolling down on the horizon. The guys are put on the tabletop, cut loose, and the Don Lamberto leaves. So when we started the story, I knew of this. I didn't know the stowaways' names, but I thought, wow. To jump to the end, one stowaway survived, the other didn't. The storm battered them pretty bad. Neither guy knew how to swim. They wash up with their raft, both guys, both alive, one barely, in Liberia. And one of the 2 dies pretty soon thereafter, the other lives. And one of the challenges of this story was finding the guy who lived, figuring out his name for starters, and then tracking him down in all of Africa. And we got really lucky, a lot of gumshoe, but we found the guy 20 feet from where he originally stowed away in Cape Town in a shanty. So category 1, Don Lamberto, stowaways, and sort of what it tells about the lawlessness of the space and the post 9/11 era and the sort of unintended consequences of national security steps. Category 2, intentional dumping. So every 3 years on average, ships intentionally dump, not spills, oil into the ocean to the amount that is more than the BP and Exxon Valdez spills combined every 3 years. That data blew me away, and I thought, that's insane. The ocean's a big place, right? 2/3 of the planet's covered by water. Dilution's a real thing. But at that rate, that's a lot of waste, a lot of insoluble waste. The Don Lamberto was a great poster child for this because the ship was caught on satellite, intentionally dumping and creating a 90-mile oil slick off the coast of Africa. So really solid evidence that here's another crime that we can discuss and use the Don Lamberto as our poster child. Category 2. Category 3, less dramatic but hugely pervasive, abuse of seafarers and specifically abandonment. So not like, dramatic putting guys over on a raft or killing at sea, other stuff we found, but still really consequential. Hundreds of thousands of seafarers work on these ships, be they fishing, be they cargo, and the protections for those 99.9% men, those guys, are very limited for lots of reasons that I think the crowd knows well, the transnational nature of this industry and the flagging structure, et cetera. And one of the most common abuse, other than standard wage theft, they just don't pay them, is abandonment. And what that looks like can be dramatic. Maritime companies are often shells within shells within shells, P.O. box to a guy in Liberia, which is registered to someone else in Nigeria, which is a fake name to someone in Greece, and just elaborate layers, intentionally designed. So a ship runs into mechanical problems or insurance problems or crew problems, financial problems, or 5 layers up, the company that is the holding company runs, whatever. The ship is stuck because of some legal issue or some financial issue. The guys on the ship are stuck. They don't have money to get or papers to get off wherever they are, and they don't have a way to get back because the ship's either broken or not allowed to move. So there they stay. And there are cases of pretty severe desperation, starvation, guys drowning, trying to jump off, because often you're parked in port, but that means a half mile from shore. Guys jump off, they try to swim, they drown, they try to make it in, they get locked up. all this is off the radar of our publication and most of people's consciousness, but it's a pretty big problem. So the Donna Liberta had a long track record of abandoning crew. And we honed in on one incident which got pretty severe. Romanian crew, we found one of the Romanian guys who was on there and was sort of left there for quite a while and went to his small town, Galati, and interviewed him. So these were the three categories. And this is why we chose the Donna Liberta. And that was 9 minutes for one story, so that's too long. But you can see that this was sort of an opener for the series. And again, not to plug my own production, but this isn't my production, so it feels okay. The videos that went along with the series were amazing, including the one here, where you hear from David Mundalwa, who's the Tanzanian who survived on the raft, and he recounts what that was like. So let's move to the next story. And again, that first story, and because I'm trying to stick with a timetable here, offers an initial sense of, so why is this kind of, how can these sorts of crimes occur and with some regularity and almost uniform impunity, most importantly. I won't go into the answers to that question because there are too many. The second story was a story that we called, in our discussion, violence. So violence at sea is a real problem. Violence of officers on crew, violence between ships, violence of private security towards pirates, violence towards private security towards non-pirates, fishermen, who are later claimed to be pirates, violence. There's a booming arms trade. There's a joke in the arms community about, when you can't sell your guns, sell them to ships. It's where a lot of the guns end up. They move in from conflict zone to shore to ship. So I had wanted to do a story about violence, but I didn't really have a sort of, when you're gonna write 5,000 words, you can't keep people's attention. You really need a narrative. You gotta make a story. It can't be a lecture. So the challenge here was how to do that with this conceptual issue. And I was struggling with that. I was out on the next story, which is sea slaves, on boats on the South China Sea for 5 weeks with a photographer. And I hadn't figured out how we were going to do violence. And I got an email from an Interpol source, and the subject line of the email said, "Brace yourself." And this is a guy who's a real straight shooter, as a lot of law enforcement types are. And when he sends me stuff, I know it's solid. And so when he says "brace yourself," I thought, do I really want to watch this video? And he knew what I was working on. So the video was this, which is on the website in a somewhat sanitized version. It's a 10-minute long video. On the website, we put up about 2 minutes. There was a really heated debate within the Times about, on the one end of the spectrum where I was, I said, show them everything, the blood, we shouldn't be withholding, the sort of puritanical view of full disclosure on that side. On the other side, legitimate point of view was, we want to be careful about violence porn and that perspective, kind of that skepticism. So we met somewhere in the middle. The video is, the 10-minute video shows 4 definitively and 5 most likely men being killed. The men are in the water. The shooter is on a Taiwanese tuna longliner. So the story on the video is this. The video was found on a cell phone in the back of a taxi in Fiji. It was found by a student, a young guy. Found it in the cab. He started looking through it, found this video, was taken aback, handed it into the police. Fijian police did what they could, forensics on the phone, not a whole lot there, had been passed forward by phones. That wasn't the original filming phone. Passed it up to Interpol, and then began investigation, both by the Times, us, and others. What we know now about the video is it occurred most likely, this incident occurred most likely in the Indian Ocean. It shows 4 men being shot. The official version from the relevant governments is, the speculation is the men in the water, excuse me, the official version from the one vessel that we figured out was at the scene. We went to the owner of that vessel, the company that owns it, and interviewed the CEO. And his version was he had indeed been told of the incident by the captain when the captain got back. His vessel was not the shooter vessel. They were passing, and the guys in the water were pirates. Now, how he knows that, if his vessel wasn't actually involved in the shooting, we don't know. But it's the standard line, and that was what lit me up journalistically, because I had heard this piracy card played so many times before, often illegitimately, as sort of a cover for other types of conflicts, and this struck me as a chance to talk about that. Much as this story is, which is a hodgepodge, I'll sort of offer up some of the hodgepodge findings. There's no international body, not Interpol, not the International Maritime Organization, not even a private entity. There's an anti-piracy group in Kuala Lumpur, but that tracks violence, the real type of violence. The Captain Phillips violence, the piracy that we know about, is real. It's subsided to a large degree now. But the tier down from there, the violence between ships on, not Maersk container ships, but ships on the size of the Donna Liberta, fishing vessels especially, or cargo that handle fishing vessels, fuel, that violence is far more pervasive and far less tracked, and in some ways far more consequential in terms of lives lost. And so that was the level, that was the tier of violence we wanted to focus on. We attempted to build a database to get some semblance of what are some legitimate numbers, and the Navy and others helped us build it. So one huge problem in terms of this space, the high seas and the maritime world, is the complete lack of tracking of crime, especially violent crime. In reporting for this story, a photographer and I had heard about this strange institution or business niche, or I'm not sure what you would call it, called armories, floating armories. And I sense there's some military folks in the room who may know of this. But so post 9/11, it became much tougher to roll into port with guys with guns for obvious reasons. Countries were a little bit nervous. Post Mumbai, people were nervous about having ships with private security or any arms in their national waters, much less in their port. And so those rules globally got tighter. At the same time, post 2008, 2009, Somali piracy really kicked up. So, and for the first time in maritime history, as far as I can tell, and most of the smart people I talk to, more importantly, the industry and the developed world said, kind of reversing a long post-Mare Liberum trajectory of de-arming the seas, reversed and said, arm yourselves, and told the Maersk order ships, go all full in on private security. We can't. We don't have the resources, we don't have the Navy, we don't have the interest, frankly, in policing this matter. And so you guys, industry, take care of it. So thus emerged this massive private maritime security industry, and now what the figure is often 90% of the big container ships, the big cargo ships, have armed guards. And that played a big role in reducing Somali piracy, other factors too. But you've got guys with guns on your ship, and you've got stuff you've got to deliver in port. You've got a problem, because you need to get in port, but you got to get those guys off the ship, but you have to go through a rough neighborhood. Thus emerged, well, for a while they were just dumping the guns in Kenya. I mean, you go to Kenya and there are thousands of guns, literally, because it was cheaper to dump them in the water and buy a new set out than to deal with all the red. But then emerged floating armories, which are these fascinating floating hotels that are boats that essentially are gun depot, you store your weapons, and bunks. And all the guys from different companies, different nationalities stay there. And they're usually at the 13-mile line, so just outside the 12 national, international demarcation. And they're sometimes whole neighborhoods of them, So we went to the Persian Gulf, photographer and I, and spent some time on one of these armories. Two, in fact. One that was just god-awful and notorious, and likely the producer tied with the company that produced the guys that shot the prior story, or the video. And then one on the high end, the sort of gold standard, and sort of spent some time, mostly just to get access to these guys and hear their perspective on these issues, but also just to see what a strange place. Anyway, so hodgepodge. This story attempted to give some perspective on why there's so much violence. All right, so we're at 20 minutes. There's no way I'm going to make it through 6 stories. So let me just do a 1-minute version of each. So the next story is a topic I bet most people in the room know well. It is sea slavery. So forced, captive, indentured labor is a big problem in the maritime world. And it's not just a South China Sea, Thailand problem. It's off the coast of the Philippines, it's Indonesian waters, it's off the coast of West Africa. South China Sea and Thailand's problem has gotten a lot of attention because it's a really acute case and big numbers. And it's complicated by a migrant issue where Rohingya and Laotians and Cambodians are coming into the country, which is almost a middle-class country, less than 0.5% unemployment. So Thais are not taking the jobs in the sex trafficking industry or the fishing industry. They're using foreign labor for that. That's where the problem emerges. So we wanted to do a story about the sea slavery problem and went to South China Sea to do that. And to stick with my deadline, the goal there was, this is in some ways a known problem, so how can we do it differently? The thought was, after some initial reporting, it became clear that the most acute cases of this were said to occur based on interviews of escaped deckhands on this certain class of ships called transshipment vessels. And these are the vessels, and this is where it overlaps with environmental issues. The short version, I'm completely breaking my rule here, is you overfish, you run out of fish close to shore, the boats have to go much further out to catch quota. They get so far out that the fuel return quotient becomes impossible financially. So the only way that those boats can catch enough to make money is stay out there. So some of these boats, this order of long-haul boats, purse seiners, longliners, stay out and just keep fishing the whole time. And then there are motherships, the Donna Liberta was an example of a mothership, that bring ice, women, drugs, parts, fuel out, fish back, and the boats keep fishing. Those are transshipment boats. The transshipment boats, South China Sea and elsewhere, that's where you have the most acute sea slavery. That's where guys are taken for 3-4 years, never come to shore. That's where we find, for example, the guy we interviewed who was shackled by the neck for a year straight, except for when he was working. I mean, this stuff that you can't imagine still exists. And that's where we got on one of these boats. Our goal was, there'd been reporting up until this point onshore, a lot of amazing reporting, AP, Al Jazeera, a lot of people. But no one had ever actually tried to get out on the water and see these boats, this problem, these people, and quite especially onto the transshipment boats. So that's essentially what we attempted to do and eventually succeeded in doing by hopscotching out. And we focus on one boat in particular. We stayed for a while with Cambodian boys and men, all indentured, Thai crew, Thai officers, Thai Cambodian crew, sea slaves. Okay. Chase should be quick. It's just an epic narrative. It wrote itself. It's a story that, again, source tipped me off to, kind of with a, have you heard about this thing that's going on type call? No. There's the longest chase in history occurring right now. It goes like this. Sea Shepherd, a left, more radical, direct action offspring of Greenpeace, decided they were irked by the fact that governments were not going after known illegal actors. So as an experiment, they said, let's choose the purple list Interpol. Purple listed vessels are arrest on site vessels. Let's choose those 6 purple listed vessels, not a huge list. Let's find them, show to the world they can be found, and then let's chase them. And every time they try to come in port, raise a stink. Call reporters, just, kind of blow the horn and almost shame them, and the government really, into not allowing them into port. Interesting experiment. 2 weeks after looking for the top listed Interpol purple noted ship called the Thunder, top because it had the highest dollar figure on stolen fish, toothfish of the tune of $67 million over the last decade. They found these guys. That's a story in and of itself, but they found these guys in Antarctica, and they began chasing them, and the Thunder ran. Thus began a 10,000-mile chase from Antarctica all the way up to the coast of Africa. I got a call halfway through, and as any journalist, I think anyone would say, I got to get on that boat. I need to get on that. So complicated, but finally got on the boat, and this is a story about that chase and sort of makes a larger point about. And Secretary Kerry made the same point himself in a speech in Chile. This love or hate Sea Shepherd, this is not something that NGOs should be doing. This is something that governments need to be doing. And so that's Chase. So that's not the last story. Okay, so the second last story was called Manning, or the slug in journalistic terms. The one-word moniker for it was Manning. Every time you talk with people deep in the maritime world, and you talked about seafarer issues, labor issues, the people, especially, again, let's get out of the Maersk realm. We're talking about a whole different order, and the vast majority of the bodies and ships that are out there in the order I'm talking about, not the Maersk. If you mentioned manning agencies, you got kind of a verbal eye roll, like, oh, yeah. And I kept getting that reaction, and I thought, okay, what's up with the manning agencies? And these are employment agencies, essentially, and they find the crews, and they kind of are what Li and Feng does in Garment. That's what manning agencies are, and they're based in Taiwan and the Philippines and Dubai and all sorts of, in LA, and they essentially, you got this cargo and this ship and this deadline, and you're missing two guys, and they connect the dots, and some of them are great. They play by the rules and they treat their staff well, and a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are just horrific, and they're little more than a storefront office in a strip mall next to a sex shop in Singapore, like the one we focused on, which was a notorious one that had a long track record of recruiting villagers. They intentionally, this was called Step Up Marine, intentionally focused on non-seafarers, and they went and focused on small villages in the Philippines. The Philippines, interestingly, produces a quarter to a half of all the seafarers in the world. Fascinating story there. But and so Step Up, based in Singapore, and these manning agencies are rarely based, for very smart reasons, in the countries where they recruit. So Singapore-based company has recruiters in these tiny villages. Lina Bonsour, in particular, is where we went, and would recruit these guys, tell them you're going to make $500 a month, you'll be back, all these things, none of which are true. And, a standard scenario plays out. The seafarer has to put up the money to get access for the job. They go to Manila, they fill out paperwork, they send a little bit more money, they work their way to Singapore, then they're locked down in now you're starting to look almost like Mexican border trafficking situations. You're locked in a room, in an apartment, 6th floor, 10th floor above the office. You stay there 2 weeks on end, sometimes a month on end, a couple days on end, 10 guys in a room, just horrific room. The main guy who guards the room rapes the men at night. Eventually they dispatch. This company focused on a class of ships that has huge problems, Taiwanese tuna longliners. And they produce most of the crews. The crews they put out are mostly for those ships. And so this case was a case that we looked at specifically of manning agencies, and a guy in particular whose picture you can see there, who went via one of these agencies to a Taiwanese tuna longliner and came back in a box, dead. The first autopsy that was done in Singapore said he died in his sleep. A handwritten note that we got from the captain said he was sick. The body gets back to the Philippines. It's missing organs. It's missing an eye. It's covered in bruises, slashes. So a criminal prosecution was opened up tied to this case and the overall trafficking of what turned out to be dozens, if not hundreds, of other villagers from that area in the Philippines through the same company to these same ships. So larger issues come out about sort of the labor practice of the seafaring world. But just to finish, the most recent story was maybe last week of last year, late December. It was called Repo, and it was about thievery at sea, and sort of in some ways it's a cousin story to the Sea Shepherd story, in that the point there is kind of, this is a lawless place, the high seas, and as such it has space for bad actors like the Thunder and vigilantes like Sea Shepherd. And similarly, on the thievery front, you have this robust and fascinating world of either traditional theft, they get on your ship and they kick the crew off and they take it, or more often, white-collar piracy, which is ships that roll into ports and through some sort of scam are essentially bilked of lots of fines and fees and whatnot so as to get the ship out, or the ship is actually kept. And this certain suborder of repo men who do extraction work, which is a kind of subclass of repo, maritime repo. And those are the guys that are called in when a ship is stuck in Haiti or the DR, and this guy is an example, a guy named Max Hardberger. You can't make these things up. They're called in to fly in and essentially negotiate the bad actors back to planet Earth, meaning the ship's worth $1 million, you're trying to hit it with a $50 million fine, they damage your dock for about $20,000, come on. And so these guys are flown in to negotiate that situation. If they fail, then sometimes an extraction order is put in. And these guys have small teams, they never, so they say, I talked to about a dozen of them, never armed, but they use guile and prostitutes and trickery and witch doctors and alcohol and all sorts of chicanery to basically steal the ship back out to the high seas, and off they go. So I'll end there very abruptly. Sorry to go so long, and either stop or... Okay. Sorry to be so abrupt, but someone's got to have a question.
Just a quick question. You talked about trying to compile a data set. I was curious, I really love it when the New York Times is able, because data is so important and there's so much data. I was curious if your editor or you see readership being interested in that data and sort of what motivated you to pursue it.
Yeah, so the data was trying to get a self-respecting estimate or a floor number on the amount of violent crime. We teamed up with Office of Naval Intelligence and 2 private security kind of data firms that sort of track that stuff. And the 3 of them with the Times essentially vacuumed in everything they had and sort of deduped it, if you will, took out and then cleaned it to, kind of make sure that we believed these renditions. The 2 private firms specialize in, again, the money is with the Captain Phillips piracy tracking, because that's where the deep pockets are, the Maersk who can pay for that stuff, and the insurers want to know where the new risky neighborhood is, and they want to keep track of that kind of stuff. But in the vacuuming, in the work that those firms do for that tracking, they often pull in the stuff I was interested in. And that's essentially what we built, and we got some decent numbers. Oh, and Oceans Beyond Piracy, which is an amazing group, does really good work based in Colorado. They also worked with us to build the data set. The only agreement, and we don't tend to like to do this, but we did in this case, was we were not allowed to publish it or share it for obvious proprietary reasons. Yeah.